The first thing anyone noticed about Miss Eleanor Finch was her composure. It was a formidable thing, built over 72 years of genteel poverty and sharp observation, as much a part of her as the silver-threaded bun coiled neatly at the nape of her neck or the faint, perpetual scent of lemon verbena and old books that clung to her person. It was this composure that did not falter when her housekeeper, Mrs. Dobbs, burst into the morning room, her face the color of whey and her cap askew. "Miss Finch." "Oh, Miss Finch," she gasped, one hand pressed to her heaving bosom. Eleanor lowered her copy of Marcus Aurelius, her gaze calm and assessing over the rim of her spectacles. "Compose yourself, Mrs. Dobbs. Has the cat gotten into the larder again? I told you to ensure the latch was secure." "No, ma'am. It's in the library." The housekeeper's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "A body." Eleanor's heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs, a traitorous leap of emotion that was swiftly quelled. She placed the book carefully on the occasional table beside her, marking her place with a silk tassel. "A body," she repeated, her tone devoid of inflection. "Are you quite certain it is not Mr. Paisley from the village, who has partaken of too much sherry and chosen an unconventional place for his repose?" "He's dead, ma'am. Cold and still. A young woman. I've never seen her before." That was the crucial piece of information. A stranger. In her library. Dead. Eleanor rose, smoothing the folds of her gray wool dress. "Very well. We shall not disturb the scene. You will go directly to the telephone and summon the police. Inform them of the situation. I will secure the door." The grand old house, Willowbrook Hall, was unusually quiet for a Saturday morning. The remnants of last night's house party still lingered in the air, a whiff of cigar smoke clinging to the velvet curtains, a forgotten champagne flute gathering dust on a console table, the faint echo of laughter and jazz music that seemed to have seeped into the very wallpaper. The guests, a collection of her nephew Gerald's bright young things and a few of her more tolerable acquaintances, were still abed, sleeping off the excesses of the evening. The library door was ajar. Eleanor pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The familiar scent of leather bindings, beeswax, and paper momentarily overwhelming the metallic tang of something else, something foul. The room was her sanctuary, a double-height chamber lined with books that climbed towards an ornate plasterwork ceiling. Morning light streamed through the tall, mullioned windows, illuminating dancing dust motes and falling, with brutal clarity, upon the centerpiece of the Persian rug. She was, as Mrs. Dobbs had stated, a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with hair the color of spun gold fanned out around a face of porcelain perfection. She was dressed not in an evening gown suitable for a house party, but in a cheap, garish sequined dress of emerald green, the kind one might see in a London dance hall. One arm was flung out, the fingers delicately curled, as if in mid-gesture. There was no visible wound, no obvious sign of violence, only a profound and absolute stillness that was more terrifying than any gore. Eleanor's eyes, however, missed little. A small, dark smudge on the girl's cheek, possibly a bruise or dirt, the way one of her silver-strapped shoes had a broken heel. And beside her outstretched hand, half tucked under the fringe of the rug, was a single, playing card. The Queen of Hearts. The sound of footsteps and panicked voices echoed in the hall. A moment later, her nephew Gerald appeared in the doorway, his dressing gown hastily tied, his usually impeccably slicked hair in disarray. "Aunt Eleanor, Mrs. Dobbs is in a state, saying there's been some sort of, oh my God." His eyes found the body on the rug, and his face lost all its color. He stumbled back, clutching the doorframe. Who is that?" "That," said Eleanor Finch, her voice as dry as the pages of her books, "is precisely what the police will wish to ascertain." Detective Inspector Alistair Crowe disliked the country. He disliked the deafening quiet, the way the air smelled of damp earth and vegetation, and the pervasive, cloying scent of privilege that clung to houses like Willowbrook Hall. As his motorcar crunched up the gravel drive, he took in the imposing Georgian facade, a monument to inherited wealth and, in his experience, hidden rot. He was a man in his late 40s, with the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much of the world's underbelly and a cynicism worn like a well-fitted coat. His own suit was serviceable but slightly rumpled, a stark contrast to the polished perfection of his surroundings. He was met in the grand entrance hall by a pale but collected Miss Finch. She did not offer a trembling hand or a flutter of nerves. Instead, she gave him a brief, firm nod. "Detective Inspector, I am Eleanor Finch. The body is in the library. The scene has been preserved. My housekeeper discovered her at 7:15 this morning. No one has entered since, save for myself for a brief visual confirmation." Crow was mildly impressed. "Thank you, Miss Finch. That is commendably efficient." His gaze swept over the hall, noting the signs of a recent party. "A house full of guests, I understand." "They are currently being assembled in the drawing room by my nephew, Gerald. I thought it best to keep everyone together." A sound strategy. He gestured for his sergeant, a young, keen-faced man named Evans, to begin with the library. "If you'll excuse me." The library was exactly as described. The girl was a splash of vulgar color on the refined tapestry of the room. Crow knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and examined her without touching. No obvious cause of death. The broken heel, the smudge on her cheek, and the card, the Queen of Hearts. He bagged it carefully. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low, "get the photographer and the police surgeon in here. I want this room gone over inch by inch. And find out who she is. No one seems to know her." An hour later, the drawing room was a tableau of strained nerves. Gerald Finch, a handsome man of 30 with the easy charm of someone who had never wanted for anything, was pouring stiff brandies for a few of the more shaken guests. His wife, Cynthia, a brittle socialite with a waspish tongue, was chain-smoking by the fireplace. The other guests comprised a typical cross-section of the idle rich. A pompous MP named Sir Edmund Blythe, a celebrated but notoriously temperamental actress named Lillian de Winter, a quiet, watchful academic named Professor Armitage, and a few other hangers-on whose names Crow had already forgotten. Crow stood before them, his notebook in hand. "The young woman in the library. Does anyone know who she is? Has anyone seen her before?" A chorus of denials. Shaken heads. Averted eyes. "She wasn't a guest," Gerald said, his voice a little too loud. "Good Lord, we don't know people like that." The condescension in his tone was palpable. "People like what, Mr. Finch?" Crow asked mildly. "You know that sort." Gerald gestured vaguely, encompassing the girl's cheap dress, her profession, her very otherness. "I see." Crow's eyes continued to scan the room. They landed on Miss Finch, who was sitting in a high-backed chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, observing the proceedings with the detached interest of a naturalist studying a colony of ants. "Miss Finch," he said, "the library is your domain, is it not?" "It is." "Did you notice anything amiss when you retired last night? Any unusual sounds?" "An open window." "I retired at 11 o'clock, she said precisely. "The party was at its zenith in the ballroom. The library was locked, as is my custom. I am most particular about my books." "Locked." Crow pounced on the word. "So how did the young lady gain entry?" "That," said Eleanor, meeting his gaze squarely, "is your mystery to solve, Detective Inspector." The initial interviews yielded nothing but a fog of alibis and feigned ignorance. The police surgeon's preliminary report stated the cause of death was likely asphyxiation, but not by manual strangulation. There were faint petechiae in the eyes and minute fibers caught in the sequins of her dress, suggesting a pillow or a similar soft object. Time of death was placed between midnight and 2 a.m. The girl was identified through a small, discreet tattoo on her ankle, a sparrow, as one Ruby Sparrow Jones, a dancer from a Soho club called the Blue Orchid. Crow stood on the terrace, smoking a cigarette and staring out at the manicured lawns. The case was a mess. A girl from the London underworld, dead in a locked library in the heart of the Buckinghamshire countryside. It made no sense. She was not killed here. He turned. Miss Finch stood beside him, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. "I beg your pardon." "The rug," she said. "It's a valuable Isfahan. When poor Mr. Paisley from the village had his episode with the port, the stain was tremendous. If that young woman had been asphyxiated on that rug, there would be some sign. Saliva, perhaps, or other effluents. There was none. The body was placed there." Crow stared at her, his cynicism momentarily suspended. He had been thinking the exact same thing. You are very observant. A lifetime of practice, Inspector. Furthermore, the playing card. The Queen of Hearts. It is from a specific deck. Bicycle brand, manufactured in America. We use Waddington's #1 in this house. Someone brought that card with them. This was new information. You are certain? Absolutely. The design on the back is quite distinct. I noticed it immediately. Crow felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Professional respect. Miss Finch, it appears you have a talent for this. I have a talent for noticing when the narrative does not fit the facts, she replied. It is the same with a poorly constructed novel. The clues must be consistent. Here, they are not. A London dancer in a country library. An American playing card in an English home. A murder with no visible violence. It is a story written by a clumsy author. Then perhaps, Crow said, grinding his cigarette under his heel, we need to find the author. And your knowledge of this house and its inhabitants could be invaluable. Eleanor felt a thrill, sharp and unexpected. For years, her life had been one of quiet routine, of managing a dwindling estate and observing the follies of a younger generation. Here was a puzzle, a true and terrible puzzle, that engaged her formidable intellect. I am at your disposal, Inspector, she said. Shall we begin by determining how our sparrow came to be in my library? The lock, I can assure you, was not forced. The alliance was forged not in friendship, but in a shared appreciation for facts over feelings. While Crow's men re-interviewed the staff, Eleanor took the inspector on a tour of the house, focusing on the ground floor access points. The French doors in the ballroom were left unlocked for guests to take the air, she explained. It would have been simple for someone to slip in or out. But to bring a body in? Crow mused. Risky, unless the killer was already inside. They stood in the ballroom, now empty and forlorn in the daylight, the polished floor reflecting the gray sky. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. The trophy cabinet. She led him to a glass-fronted cabinet filled with silver cups for cricket and rowing. On the bottom shelf, nestled between a loving cup and a photo of the 1921 cricket team, was a small, brass object. A key, Crow said, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to pick it up. The spare key to the library, Eleanor confirmed. It is always kept in the butler's pantry. Someone moved it here. Their next stop was the garage. Among the sleek modern motor cars belonging to the guests was Gerald's canary yellow Rolls-Royce. Crow ran a finger over the rear bumper. It came away smudged with a dark, clay-like mud. The local soil is sandy, Eleanor noted. That mud is different. It looks like the clay from the old quarry road, 5 miles from here. Crow nodded. Sergeant Evans, I want this car gone over. Inside and out. Look for anything. Back in the house, they confronted Gerald. He was in his study, attempting to project an air of business as usual, but his hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette. The key? I've no idea how it got there, he blustered. And as for the mud on my car, I took a drive yesterday afternoon to clear my head. Must have picked it up then. Alone? Crow asked. Yes, quite alone. Eleanor, who had been silently examining the books on his shelf, turned. You are lying, Gerald. He started. Aunt Eleanor, I beg your pardon. You were seen, she said calmly, by old Mr. Hemsley, the gamekeeper. He mentioned it to Mrs. Dobbs this morning, who mentioned it to me. He saw your car parked in the lane near the quarry yesterday, and you were not alone. There was a woman with you, a woman with golden hair. Gerald's face crumpled. The charming facade evaporated, leaving behind a frightened, weak man. Oh God, it was her. It was Ruby. She was blackmailing me. The drawing room had become an impromptu interrogation chamber. Under the combined pressure of Crow's grim persistence and his aunt's disappointed gaze, Gerald's story tumbled out. He had met Ruby Jones months ago in London, during a night of reckless gambling and drinking. He'd been infatuated. He'd written her letters, foolish, passionate letters that mentioned certain financial indiscretions he had committed to cover his debts, specifically, siphoning money from the estate trust of which Eleanor was the primary beneficiary. She threatened to show the letters to you, Aunt Eleanor, and to the police, Gerald whined, his head in his hands. She wanted £500. I agreed to meet her last night, to give her the money. I drove her to the quarry to talk, to reason with her. But we argued. She said she'd take the money and still expose me. I left her there, by the quarry, at around 11. I swear, she was alive when I drove away. You left a young woman alone on a deserted road at night? Crow's voice was icy. I was angry and frightened, but I didn't kill her. The key, Gerald, Eleanor prompted, her voice soft but inexorable. How did the library key get into the trophy cabinet? He looked utterly bewildered. I don't know. I took the spare from the pantry earlier in the evening, thinking I could meet her in the library after everyone was asleep. It was the one place I was sure to be private. But when the time came, I couldn't find the key. I thought I'd lost it, so I drove out to meet her instead. Crow and Eleanor exchanged a glance. The story had the ring of truth, at least in part. But if Gerald had left Ruby alive at the quarry, how and why had her body ended up back at Willowbrook Hall? He's our prime suspect, Crow said later, in the privacy of the library, now a sterile crime scene. Motive, opportunity. He could have killed her at the quarry, panicked, and brought the body back here to confuse the investigation. It is the obvious conclusion, Eleanor agreed, but her tone was doubtful. Too obvious. Gerald is a coward and a fool, but he lacks the nerve for such a cold, calculated act. Dragging a body into a house full of people? And why the library? Why the playing card? It feels theatrical. Murder often is, Crow countered, but he was listening. The card, Eleanor mused, her eyes drifting to the empty space on the rug. The Queen of Hearts. Off with their heads. A message of execution, of judgment. The case took another turn with the arrival of Professor Armitage, the quiet academic. He sought out Crow and Eleanor, his manner diffident, but his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. I feel I must speak up, he began. Last night, I retired early, as social gatherings exhaust me. My room is on the east wing, overlooking the driveway. I was reading by the window, and I saw something. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, I saw a figure carrying a heavy, blanket-wrapped bundle from the direction of the garage towards the side door of the house. Crow leaned forward. Can you describe this person? Not well, I'm afraid. It was dark, and they were wearing a long, dark coat with a hat pulled low. But they were not tall. Of a medium, perhaps slight, build, and they moved with a sense of purpose. It wasn't Gerald. Gerald was over 6 feet tall. This opened up the field to nearly every other guest and member of the staff. The investigation widened. Crow delved into Ruby Jones's life in London, discovering she had been the girlfriend of a minor but vicious gangster named Danny, the Blade Maguire. Meanwhile, Eleanor employed her intimate knowledge of the household to subtle effect. She noticed that the actress, Lillian de Winter, had been unusually nervous, her eyes constantly darting towards Sir Edmund Blythe, the MP. She observed that Cynthia, Gerald's wife, seemed not grief-stricken or shocked by her husband's infidelity and subsequent arrest, but rather grimly satisfied. It was during a tense luncheon, a day after Gerald had been formally taken into custody, that the final piece clicked into place for Eleanor. Cynthia was complaining about the quality of the tea. It's always either too weak or stewed, she said with a shudder. Simply undrinkable. Lillian de Winter gave a brittle laugh. My dear, you are too particular. It's not as if it's a matter of life and death. And in that moment, Eleanor remembered the fibers on Ruby's dress. Not from a pillow. The initial assumption had been wrong. She looked at Cynthia's extravagant, feather-trimmed negligée she had worn down to lunch, at the plush, velvet-covered cushions on the chairs, and then she remembered something else entirely. She excused herself and went directly to the small, private sitting room off Cynthia's bedroom. It was a room of flounces and fripperies, dominated by a large, heart-shaped velvet cushion, embroidered with the phrase, Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. The cushion was new, and it was bare. Its matching counterpart, an identical heart-shaped cushion, was missing. Eleanor found Crow in the library, staring at the floor plan of the house. Inspector, she said, her voice low and urgent. I believe I have it. But we must act quickly. Please, assemble everyone in the drawing room. And have your sergeant search Cynthia Finch's private sitting room for a large, heart-shaped velvet cushion. I suspect he will not find it. When the guests were gathered once more, the atmosphere was thick with suspicion and fear. Crow stood at the head of the room, with Eleanor seated beside him, a picture of calm authority. The murder of Ruby Jones was a carefully staged performance. Crow began, his voice cutting through the murmur. But the killer made two mistakes. First, they used a prop, a specific playing card, the Queen of Hearts, to point the finger at Gerald Finch, whose affair with the victim provided a convenient motive. The second mistake was the murder weapon itself. Eleanor took over, her voice clear and carrying. It was not a pillow from a bed. The fibers matched those of a specific type of velvet used for a pair of decorative cushions. Cushions in the shape of a heart, one of which is now missing from this house. All eyes turned to Cynthia. She paled, but her chin went up in defiance. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" Eleanor asked. "You knew of your husband's affair. You knew he was being blackmailed. You saw it as an opportunity to be rid of him, to have his fortune and his freedom. You followed him last night, or perhaps you even orchestrated the meeting. You took the library key from where he'd carelessly left it, knowing it would implicate him later. You waited for him to leave Ruby at the quarry, and then you approached her." Crow continued the narrative. "You offered her more money. Perhaps you pretended to be an ally. You lured her back here, to the library, using the key you had. And there, when her back was turned, you pressed that heavy, heart-shaped cushion over her face and held it until she stopped moving." "You have no proof," Cynthia hissed. "We have the testimony of Professor Armitage, who saw a figure of your build carrying the body into the house," Crow said. "We will find the missing cushion, Mrs. Finch. It will be stained with her makeup, her saliva. You had to hide it, but you couldn't bring yourself to burn it, could you? It was part of a set, a symbol of the love you felt Gerald had betrayed. You kept it, and we will find it." The dam broke. Cynthia's composure shattered into 1,000 pieces. "He humiliated me," she screamed, her eyes blazing with a hatred that was years in the making. "With that common little tramp. He was going to ruin us, ruin everything I had worked for. It was his fault. The Queen of Hearts. Off with his head. It was perfect. He deserved to hang for what he did to me." Her confession echoed in the stunned silence of the room. The following week, Willowbrook Hall was quiet. Gerald, released from custody a broken and sobered man, had retreated to a friend's estate in Scotland. The guests had departed, scattering like leaves in the wind. The library had been thoroughly cleaned, the Persian rug sent away for restoration. Detective Inspector Crow stood once more in the entrance hall, his hat in his hand. "She hid the cushion in the one place she thought no one would look," he said to Eleanor. "The linen closet, tucked inside a box of her own winter furs. The forensics matched perfectly. A rather pedestrian hiding place, in the end," Eleanor remarked. "I had hoped for something more imaginative from her." A ghost of a smile touched Crow's lips. "You, Miss Finch, are a marvel. I would not say this to another living soul, but I could have pinned it on Gerald and been done with it. Your insistence on the narrative, it saved an innocent man, albeit a foolish one, from the gallows." "The truth may not always be pleasant, Inspector, but it has a symmetry that falsehood lacks," she replied. "I merely helped correct the narrative." He offered her his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her grip was firm and dry. "Should you ever find yourself in London and in need of a distraction from your books," he said, a rare warmth in his weary eyes, "the Metropolitan Police could use a consultant with your particular talents." Eleanor Finch watched him walk down the drive to his waiting motor car. The house was silent again, the mystery solved, the equilibrium restored. But as she turned and walked back towards her library, the scent of old books and lemon verbena welcoming her home, she felt a curious sense of anticlimax. The real world, for a brief, brutal, and brilliant moment, had been more compelling than any fiction. She paused at the library door, her hand on the polished brass handle. Then, with a decisive nod, she entered. There were, after all, still a great many books left to read.